Hello, and welcome to this manufacturing management webinar in association with XTons. My name is Paul Fanning, and I'm editor of Manufacturing Management. Today's presentation is entitled Practical Guide to Becoming a Net Zero Manufacturer, and it will be given by Letizia Pancrazi, a commercial manager for XTons. Before I hand over to Letizia, however, I should just say that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will endeavour to answer them at the end. If we don't have time to answer your question, please rest assured that we will pass it on to XTons and they will be able to answer it for you offline. And with that, it just remains for me to hand over to Letizia. Letizia.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. I've slightly rewritten the name of this presentation, but very much will still be a practical guide on how you can navigate the net zero environment. My name's Letizia. I've been a sustainability expert for over 10 years now, and I'm working at XTons. We are a carbon action platform focusing on helping businesses like manufacturers that face tough carbon challenges. In terms of what I will cover today, so I will talk about how you can quantify those pesky carbon emissions. I will talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape and how you can navigate it. I will talk about targets that you can set, and then I will give tips and best practice as well as some of the interventions that you can look at when you build your decarbonization plan. In terms of the learning outcomes today, you will learn why it is important for manufacturing business to decarbonize, and in doing so, quantifying your emissions. You will understand what is carbon accounting and how it works in practice. You will understand the regulatory environment and how it pertains to your business. You will know how to set the right target for your business, and you will know the type of actions that you can take in order to decarbonize. Just an overview of the process which follows the structure of the webinar today. We will first talk about quantifying your emissions, which should be the first step that you take as you look to decarbonize. We will then talk about setting your target and also mention regulations and standards that may be relevant. And we will finish by how can you reduce your emissions by building your decarbonization plan. So without further ado, let's talk about how you can quantify your emission and an introduction as to what is carbon accounting. So why does carbon and carbon accounting and decarbonization matter to the manufacturing sector? Around the world, the manufacturing and construction sector account for 1/5 of global carbon emissions and 54% of the world's energy usage. It is considered a hard to decarbonize sector, but one that is crucial for us to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and to maintain a temperature increase below the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was agreed at the Paris Agreement. In 2018, the Committee on Climate Change published its 6th carbon budget report, and in it stated that the manufacturing and construction sectors accounted for 66 million tons of CO2 equivalent, 12% of the UK's total footprint. The manufacturing sector represented 90% of these emissions. So again, a key sector to decarbonize for the UK to meet its own goal of reaching net zero by 2050. But decarbonization matters beyond just reducing carbon. It is also beneficial to the manufacturing sector. It offers you opportunities to reduce your cost. It offers opportunities for new business innovations. It has risk mitigation opportunities in terms of future-proofing your business, but also building your supply chain resilience. It allows you to meet the demands of your investors, your stakeholders, or your employees, and it allows you to attract and retain talent. And why we particularly find the manufacturing sector interesting at XTON in terms of decarbonization is that you have the ability to reduce more than just the emissions of your direct operations. Thanks to the products that you manufacture and your large supply chains, you can have an indirect impact on how others also achieve carbon savings. What is carbon accounting? So carbon accounting is the process of assessing or measuring your carbon emission. This is done for a reporting entity. This can be a business, it can be done for an individual, an activity, a region, and even an entire country. A carbon footprint is the total amount of greenhouse gases, which includes carbon dioxide, as per the name, but also other greenhouse gases like methane. These greenhouse gases will be generated by a business, which will be the one reporting on its carbon footprint. You will see that a carbon footprint can sometimes be expressed as CO2 with a little e next to it. This means carbon dioxide equivalent, and it means that the footprint is not just taking into account carbon, but it's also taking into account other greenhouse gases. Carbon is often used as the metric as it's the most abundant of the greenhouse gas that we emit. A business's carbon footprint can be modeled and reported against 3 scopes of emission, which we will look at very shortly. And this modeling process will then calculate the emissions associated with a business activities or its assets, which are divided in different categories. By conducting a carbon accounting exercise, an organization is better able to understand where it has these carbon hotspots, which are your larger source of carbon emissions, and it is better able to inform how it can decarbonize in a cost-efficient way. One point that is worth noting is that a carbon footprint is always modeled unless you have little devices around your business that is measuring the exact carbon emissions associated with a specific activity or an asset. Regardless of the method that you are using, when you do carbon accounting, you are actually modeling that footprint. This is important because it means that there's always a range of uncertainty associated with these carbon accounting method, and businesses must be aware of that range of uncertainty in order to remain transparent, avoid greenwashing, and again, better inform its decarbonization efforts. How do you start your carbon accounting process? Your first step will be to set your organizational boundary. This is like putting a giant dome over your entire business, your partners, your clients, your customers, your supply chains. The size of this dome will be based on the approach that you choose. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the gold standard in carbon accounting and publishes frameworks and standards to help businesses in the public and the private sector decarbonize, recommends 2 different approaches: the equity chair or the control approach. Under the control approach, a reporting entity will account for 100% of the emissions that are under its operational or its financial control. In the equity share, a business would only account for the emission according to its share of equity in the operation. If an organization fully owns all operation, the methods are basically the same. Once you have made this decision, which allows you to consolidate your emissions and know which part of the business you will be looking at and where your responsibility is in terms of emitting those emissions, you would move to the second step, which is choosing your operational boundary. Your operational boundary is where that choice of scopes comes in. There are 3 scopes of emissions, which are then further divided in categories. Scope 1, in orange on the diagram, are also called your direct emissions. And this will be the greenhouse gas emission associated with fuel that you burn or gases that are released directly from the assets and the activities that you own or operate. This means your buildings, your facilities, your warehouses, vehicles ranging from cars to HGVs, as well as those pesky fugitives emissions, which are your refrigerants and are often forgotten by business, but represents a large part of businesses' carbon emissions. The second scope is Scope 2, also called indirect emissions. This is all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the transportation, distribution, and use of electricity or power to a business. This is your purchased electricity or any purchased steam, heating, and cooling. And finally, your Scope 3 emissions are all your upstream and downstream activities. They're the emissions associated with your supply chains, and they include 15 different categories. This can be your purchased goods and services, your capital goods, the waste in your operation, remote working, commutes, but also your leased assets or any investments and franchises. It is worth noting, and we'll see this when we look at the regulations and standards, that a lot of focus has been placed on measuring Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, as they are easier for a business to control. They're your direct emission. However, for the majority of businesses, most of the emissions that your business will produce will come from Scope 3. It is why in recent years, there's really been a push towards businesses starting to assess, but also address their Scope 3 emissions in order to really meet our target globally as well as a country. When you have to set your operational boundary, you will decide which scopes you are going to be quantifying, as well as which category within each scope you will be looking at. This will depend on your business type, on the type of activities that you have, your level of ambition, the data that you have at your disposal, but also if you want to meet certain targets or if you want to comply with certain regulations, there will be requirements to measure those specific scopes. And we'll touch on that in the second part of this webinar. Once you have decided your scope, you will have to actually quantify those emissions. This means collecting data within your business and then applying something called a carbon emissions factor. Bear with me, we'll touch upon the exact process very shortly. But before we do, let's talk about the 3 methods that exist to do carbon accounting. These are approved by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The first one is the spend-based method and is the most popular method and the one that has been used for the longest time. This means using your financial data, how much you're spending on a specific product, a specific service, for example, your utility bills. It is then multiplied by an emissions factor for financial value, and it gives you your carbon footprint. The spend-based method is great to get your first carbon footprint. The data is easily accessible. As a business, you probably already have quite a lot of financial data about it. However, it lacks specificity and it's not very accurate. Let's take a very simple example. You are great at negotiating and you've managed to reduce your utility bills by 50%. When you measure the carbon emissions associated with that energy consumption, because the price has been reduced by 50%, your carbon emissions will look like they've been reduced by 50%, but your consumption may not have changed. This is where there's a slight problem with the spend-based method and why there's been efforts to develop other carbon accounting methods to provide some more accurate results. One of those more accurate methods is called the physical unit method. It also is called the activity-based method, depending on which standard or framework you are using. And this is using units of mass or kilometers, kilograms, usage-based data about your assets and activities. And then once again, multiplying them by the relevant carbon emissions factor to get your carbon footprint. It tends to focus on a much more granular data collection. It will use a lot of your usage-based data. So again, that range of uncertainty I mentioned earlier is very much reduced because you are using data that is much more based on your consumption and your use of different goods and services. The flip side of this method is, as you can imagine, it can be harder to access and collect that data. And that is not always data that is available the first time a business conducts its carbon footprint, which is fine because carbon accounting should not be a one-off exercise. It should be something that you repeat every year or as frequently as you see fit for your business. And as you continue to monitor your carbon emissions year on year, you can gradually move towards using more accurate carbon accounting method that will not have this range of uncertainty like the spend-based method. The last method that we'll be looking at today is called the supplier-specific method. This is particularly useful when quantifying those Scope 3 emissions. And this involves engaging suppliers directly to get primary data from them on their products, on the services, and plugging that into your own carbon footprint. Once again, it can lead to very accurate results in terms of your carbon emissions, but it can be quite difficult to engage suppliers, particularly if you have a lot of different suppliers to engage with, and suppliers may not necessarily have that specific data if they themselves are relying on spend-based methods. The good news is that when you do your carbon footprint, you don't have to choose and use only one method. You very much should look at the kind of data that you have across the categories that you want to quantify and choose the method that is appropriate to this data in your first year. Then, as you get your first carbon footprint, you can focus on your highest source of carbon emissions, and for these sources, try to collect some more granular and more specific data to your business. And the goal of doing that is really so you can inform the actions that you are going to take. Just a little note on those Scope 2 emissions, which is something, again, that gained a lot of attraction lately, given that our grid is decarbonizing and we are moving towards renewable energy use. There are 2 ways to report on your Scope 2 emissions, which are often called your electricity or your indirect emission. You can use location-based reporting, and this will model your emission based on the electricity consumption of your power grid. So in the UK, our grid every year decarbonizes. So the carbon emissions associated with our electricity use as a business, as a household, also decreases because we are investing in more renewable energy, and the mix of that electricity is therefore greener. This also allows you, if you are a company that has offices in different countries, to see the difference in the carbon intensity of your electricity depending on that location. The second method is called the market-based reporting, and this is based on where you are purchasing your electricity from whom. So this will consider if you are, for example, only procuring renewable energy, you will get a lower carbon footprint. Both methods, again, are compliant and depend on where you are getting your electricity, what kind of data you have, and how you would want to report on that electricity. We would recommend that if you have made an effort to purchase electricity from a green or a renewable energy supplier, then the market-based reporting would give you better results. If you haven't, then location-based reporting is probably more accurate for your business. Now, how does carbon accounting work and how can you start doing it? So once you have determined your scopes, your categories, and you know what you want to be assessing, you will have gone and collected some data. The goal in carbon footprinting is to get the best A multiplied by B. A is the data that you are collecting. This is what you are consuming, what you are using, your utility bills, your smart meters, how much you're spending on professional services, the amount of waste you're generating. B is those carbon emissions factor. Carbon emissions factors are produced empirically, peer-reviewed. Some are done based on experiments to really figure out what are the carbon emissions associated with an activities. There are thousands of databases around the world of carbon emissions factors. Some are free, like the UK government has a free database of emissions factor that you can use. Others, you do have to pay to have access to them. And so once you've got your list of all the assets and activities divided by scopes and categories, you would need to find the appropriate emissions factor to measure the carbon emissions associated with your consumption or your use. But in reality, when you think about your business, there are three different aspects to consider. So we are going to introduce a new number, which is N, and these are the number of things that you are quantifying. N can be seen as the scale. So these are the number of buildings, your number of suppliers, your number of vehicles, of employees, how many things you are actually looking at. This will very much be influenced by that organizational boundary that you've set, the dome around your N. This will determine how many of those N you are going to be quantifying. Then you have your specificity, which is the number A. So here, how granular can you go? Do you have smart meter readings? Do you have the amount of waste that you're generating by waste stream? Do you know the type of fuels that you use in your vehicles? All of that can allow you to get a more accurate carbon footprint. And the final thing is your emissions factor. What is important with emissions factor is to make sure that you're choosing the correct one. This is the correct year, since some emissions factor are updated every year. Making sure you're using it for the right value that you've inputted. So for example, some emissions factor are financial, others are quantity-based, some are efficiency-based. And making sure again that you are applying it to the right category. You can find emissions factors for business travels, which will be different to private transport, even if it's with the same car. So all of that needs to be considered to make sure that you are following the right process. So let's look, earlier I mentioned that there's different carbon accounting method. Let's look at how those different carbon accounting method would lead to different calculation. Here we're going to look at vehicles, and this can be your cars, your vans, or your HGVs. In the first category, you would be looking at the total number of cars and vans of your business. How you would measure that carbon footprint. This would be using the average number of kilometers that are being driven by either, you would probably aggregate your total for car and your total for van, but you would get the average amount of mile and kilometer, and you would multiply that by the emissions factor, which is the carbon equivalent per kilometer or mile that has been traveled for the type of vehicle. And this would give you a carbon footprint. The second way to do it would be to look at each individual vehicle that your business owns, look at the fuel that has been used in those vehicles, and then how much of that fuel has been consumed. And then the emission factor that you would use is the carbon equivalent per liter of specific fuel used. As you can guess, that second methodology would give you a much more accurate carbon footprint for your vehicle's emission, because it is looking exactly at the consumption of fuel, the specific fuel in the specific car. But both methods are compliant. They just have a different range of uncertainty associated with it. The same can apply if you look at your buildings. In the first method, you could look at the number of square meters of your buildings and take the average carbon emission factor associated with a square meter of building for a manufacturing business, and this would give you a carbon footprint. Or you could take your smart meter reading and then multiply that by the relevant carbon emissions factor for the fuel you are using for your heating. What is good about this structure is that it can also help you identify opportunities to decarbonize. At Exton, we like to separate activities into 3 categories, and we'll touch on those again a little bit later. But these are mean, lean, and green. Mean are the actions that will target your number of assets and activities, your inventory. These are the hardest actions to deliver because they normally mean eliminating, removing, or seriously reducing one of your activity or getting rid of one of your assets. This, for example, is consolidating your floor plan and doing a rationalization study and trying to occupy less of a building. This may be getting rid of some of your vehicles because you've optimized your routes. This must be getting rid of some of your machines because you can get more efficient and you don't have to use as many. They are difficult, but they are the one that would give you the largest carbon reduction. The second one is lean, and this is all about the efficiency. This is about reducing that number that you are consuming and using. So this can be energy efficiency, it can be decreasing the amount of waste that you're producing, optimizing your routes, or increasing fuel efficiency. Green is everything to do with that carbon emissions factor, and it's moving to a carbon emission factor that is lower, so that when you put your value and you multiply it by the carbon emission factor, you get a lower carbon footprint. This would be, for example, changing to electric cars or moving to a green energy supplier. We will touch on actions again when we talk about the plans. I've mentioned a little bit the importance of data collection and data granularity, but data collection is critical in order to obviously measure your carbon footprint, but also improve your data granularity. The accuracy and the precision of your carbon footprint will be contingent on the data that you are able to collect and then use. Collecting data can be long and arduous, so it's why it's really important that you start by reviewing the data that you have and the data that you will need based again on these decisions that you've made as to what you are actually going to quantify as part of your carbon emissions. Don't do it alone. We're a big believer that carbon accounting should be embedded throughout your organization, and data point person should be appointed for specific activities or categories or scopes. And make it a continual process. Don't rush at the end of the year trying to collect all this data. If you can automate it, if you can embed it into existing process, if you already have data collection systems, for example, your financial ones, use those to also collect the information that you will need. Having quarterly reviews or data collection checkpoints, that can also be great in terms of improving that data collection. And data collections will help you identify where you need to obtain more granular data. Data granularity is important because it allows you once again to reduce that range of uncertainty, provides you with more insights into your operation and where you can find those sweet points, the areas where you can achieve carbon savings, but also deliver other benefits for your business. It'll also allow you to better track the impact of your interventions. If you are implementing something, but you don't have enough granularity in your data to know whether or not that has had the impact, it can, one, be a bit demoralizing, and it can prevent making more informed decision year on year. Data granularity is also a great way of engaging your employees and your investors and other shareholders into the process, as some of them may have the data that you are looking for example, your suppliers. In terms of determining your data, how granular you should go, we always recommend doing a first pass carbon footprint. Measure your carbon footprint once, see where your biggest carbon hotspots are, and then focus on the granularity. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of time collecting data without necessarily going anywhere in actually measuring your carbon footprint. So once you know your carbon footprint, determine which are your big areas of carbon and can you obtain more granular usage data for that specific activity. Do you have the capacity to collect it? Will having more granular data actually allow you to make more informed decisions about how you're going to decarbonize? A great example is refrigerants. Collecting specific data, usage data about refrigerants, can be quite complicated. And we can very quickly tell you the top 10 actions that you can take to reduce your emissions around refrigerants. So it would be better to focus your data collection effort on another category rather than the refrigerants, to allow you spending loads of time collecting this additional data without necessarily having it be useful in terms of what you will deliver later. And then finally, the most important thing about the granularity of data is that it will not necessarily bring your carbon footprint down. And wanting a lower carbon footprint should not be what drives you to get more granular data. It should really be about how you can better inform your process and your information around what you will do. Now, let's have a look at the second step. So once you've measured your carbon emissions, what do you do? Where do you start? Obviously, there's more and more regulations around the world that pertain to decarbonization or sustainability or climate change. And even though your business at the moment may not need to comply with a specific standard or specific regulations, it very well be that from 2030 and even earlier, more and more regulation frameworks and standards will become mandatory for manufacturing business. So it's always something that you should keep an eye on, and being compliant earlier can really have a lot of benefit in terms of future-proofing your business. But how is this regulatory environment actually structured? At the bottom of the pyramid, we have our global goals. These are the ones set by the United Nations, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They will focus on reducing greenhouse gas emission and help sector decarbonize, but they're also about achieving some of these wider societal goals, ending hunger, ensuring that everyone has access to education. These goals then inform the creation of reporting frameworks. Reporting frameworks can be specific to certain sectors, industries, activities, scopes of emissions. For example, loads of financial sectors will have produced their own frameworks. Make UK often produces documents pertaining to the manufacturing sector around how you can report and address decarbonization. And then finally, we have regulations. Sometimes they'll be directly linked to a specific reporting framework. Sometimes they're a little bit more general. Here in the UK, the most important law to know is that decarbonization is enshrined in law in the Climate Change Act. It was enshrined in 2008, and in 2019, following the declaration of a climate emergency, the UK government has committed legally to achieving net zero by 2050. And this is why I mentioned that there will be more regulations, things will evolve, so do keep an eye on those regulations. It's obviously not an exhaustive list, and it was very difficult to choose which regulations I would talk about today. But I'll very briefly touch on the four main ones that we've seen our clients having to interact with in the past few years. So SECR, which is Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, was introduced in the UK in 2019. Yes, 2019. And it basically provides a format and some requirements for UK businesses to report their energy and their carbon emissions. It applies to quoted UK companies of any size that are already obliged to report their greenhouse gas emissions, and unquoted companies or LLPs that meet two of the following criteria. So a turnover or gross income of 36 million or more, a balance sheet assets of 18 million or more, or employ more than 250 people. A company that can demonstrate they consume less than 400,000 kilowatt per hour energy per year doesn't have to complete SECR, even if they fall within some of the inclusion criteria I just mentioned. And in terms of the requirements, so this will differ depending on your sector and the type of company, but you have to report on your scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emission. So that was the orange and the purple on the graph we saw earlier, your direct emission. You must give some information about the energy efficiency measures that you are putting in place, and always provide the methodology that you've used. This is a big thing when you're doing your carbon accounting, making sure that you are tracking the methodology you're using, keeping some form of proof, and remain transparent about it. TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it was created by the Financial Stability Board in 2009. Its aim is to help businesses better incorporate climate-related risks and opportunities into their organization. It is mandatory for UK companies that have more than 500 employees and over 500 million turnover. It has 11 different disclosure recommendations that they've structured in 4 different areas: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. If you do want to comply with the TCFD, you will need to assess your carbon emissions across all scopes, scopes 1, 2, and 3, and you will need to indicate to what extent you want to reduce those emissions. You will also need to consider wider climate risk, whether those are your material risk or more natural risks. ESSOS is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. It's a mandatory energy assessment scheme for businesses that must be carried out every 4 years. It applies to large UK companies since 2022, and they have to employ 250 people or more, or have an annual turnover in excess of 44 million. If an organization is covered by ISO 5001, you don't need to carry an ESOS assessment, but you do need to notify the environmental agency that you are compliant with ESOS. And in terms of requirements, you must calculate your total energy consumption. So this will again involve your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And you must identify areas where you have significant energy consumption and how you will be reducing them. You must have a lead assessor, and you must keep a record to demonstrate that you're remaining compliant. And finally, PPN 0621 is a public procurement notice. It's going to support the decarbonisation of the UK public sector, and it applies to any organisation bidding on a UK public tender with a value of 5 million or more. And with this, you have to measure again those scope 1 and 2 emission. You must measure at least 5 categories of your scope 3 emissions. You must have a carbon reduction plan, and you must publish it on your website and update it annually. Now, the reason why I always talk about regulations before I talk about setting a target is that depending on which regulation you need to comply with, this may actually inform the kind of target you want to set and how you are measuring your carbon emissions. When you set a target, there are 3 simple steps. The first will be to choose your baseline year. This should be the year you are starting to reduce from. Usually, you will need to have quantified your carbon emissions for that baseline year in order to be able to know how you will be reducing those emissions. The second step is to actually select which target you want to go for, and then setting a timeline. By when? So where do you start? What do you want to achieve? Where are you going? If we look at setting a baseline year, in a baseline year can align with the science-based target initiatives, and we'll talk very briefly about those shortly. It can be your most recent year of operation. A lot of business tend to use 2018. We also caution about using 2020 or 2021 because of the pandemic and how that may have had an impact on your carbon emissions. It's good to choose a year where you have good data and a year that is representative of your normal business operation. A new business chooses its first years of operations. There are 4 targets that you can commonly choose for, but you can also decide to go with your own target. So decide without going for a particular standard or specific target. The one that you've probably heard a lot about is net zero. Net zero is all about achieving a balance between the amount of greenhouse gas that are released with those that are removed. And so again, having that net zero balance over a specific period of time. There are 3 ways to do this: reduce existing greenhouse gas emission, directly remove greenhouse gas emission, and remove greenhouse gas emission indirectly through offsetting. With net zero, it considers all the greenhouse gases. So it's really not just carbon, it's about all the other greenhouse gases. When you look at carbon neutral, it's very similar to net zero, but tends to solely focus on carbon dioxide. It does not consider other greenhouse gas emission. This means it has a lower commitment compared to targeting net zero. It may not completely future-proof your business, particularly if down the line there are requirements to also address other greenhouse gases. And some people are now saying that carbon neutral has been a bit greenwashed, with a lot of organizations claiming they are carbon neutral, but actually all they are doing is paying carbon credit to offset their emission rather than taking actions to reduce their emissions. Climate positive is about going even above and beyond net zero. So this would be removing any additional greenhouse gas emission, addressing historical emissions, so any emissions before even your baseline, and really seeking to deliver a net environmental benefits. This obviously needs a greater level of investment in terms of a business. It will require some capital investment. And one thing that could be positive in terms of the climate positive target is to look at nature-based solutions. So working with nature to deliver that net environmental benefit. And finally, reduction-only target means that there is no offsetting. You are focusing solely on reducing emissions. You are not buying carbon credit. You are not insetting within your supply chain. You are not investing in carbon storage and capture. You are only looking at how you can reduce your emissions. This is often aligned with the Science Based Targets initiative, and targets can be set in total or across each scope or across certain categories. Just in terms of the manufacturing sector, it's worth noting that Make UK, in its latest report, and has engaged a manufacturing business, made a commitment that the sector would reduce its scope 1 and 2 emissions, so again, its direct emission, by 67% by 2035 compared to its 2018 baseline. This may be a report you want to look at. It has some great tips and tricks as to how you can reduce your carbon emissions. In terms of that third step, setting a timeline, once again, just like the baseline, just like the target, it very much is up to you. The two most common dates that you will see is 2030 and 2050. 2050 is obviously the year that the UK government has set in terms of reaching that net zero goal, but many have suggested that this is far too late. And in terms of taking action, it really has to be now. We are in the decade of climate action and when decarbonization is much needed. And there's been a move in the past 5 years to shorten those timelines and try to aim for 2030. I will very briefly, these I'm hoping, and Paul can maybe confirm this, that the slides will be shared. But in terms of setting your target, these are the kind of questions and thoughts that you should be asking yourself. Remember, always start by measuring your carbon emissions so you know where you're going from, you know the size of the challenge. But when you set your target, you should be assessing your risk, your appetite for risk. You should know whether or not you have a budget because you'll need money to deliver that decarbonization. You should look at what would be the implications, both internally and externally. You should identify any further opportunity to align that decarbonization targets with other goals and other strategies. And you should be definitely involving other people, whether those are your investors, your board, your employees, into that target to make sure that your entire organization is working together. I just want to touch briefly on standards and accreditation. These are most of them are voluntary, and it's areas where you can get additional, bonus points as a leader in the manufacturing sector. But the GHGP, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, has standards and frameworks that you can use. It really breaks down all the carbon accounting process in details. They do offer an opportunity for you to get your carbon footprint verified by them, and they will really have loads of great resource that you can look at. ISO, so I'm sure everyone knows here what is ISO. They have their own categorization in terms of monitoring and reporting on your greenhouse gases. They consider it direct, energy indirect, and other indirect. Direct is your scope 1, energy indirect is your scope 2, and other indirect is scope 3. So same process as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, just a slightly different language, but a great one to get certified as a business. The Global Reporting Initiative is an independent international organization, and it sets standards and frameworks for businesses to be able to report and communicate on their impacts, including carbon impact. You can have a look at the GRI standards. There's a modular system, and again, you can get an accreditation, which is always a great way of demonstrating your leadership around decarbonization. In development at the moment are some sectorial standards. And so when they come out, there may be a manufacturing one. So it may be, again, something to look at in terms of what you can do and what you can get certified in. And finally, the Science-Based Target Initiative. You've probably heard more and more people talk about what is a science-based target. This really came out of the 2015 Paris Agreement, COP's Conference of Parties, organized by the UN on climate change. And a carbon target will be deemed science-based if it's developed in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and with the latest available climate science. And really, the goal behind having a science-based target is that it helps limit global temperature increase well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and even better if it can keep it below 1.5. The Science-Based Target Initiative manages the science-based targets, and it's a great place to have a look if it is something that you're interested in doing. Now, let's very quickly, since I've seen the time, talk about your decarbonization plan and actually how do you take all of this into action. So once you've measured your carbon emission, you've set a target, you are now ready to look at how am I actually going to meet that target. And although I've presented these steps as a very linear process, it's very important when you do your plan and set your target that you do that in tandem. So you make sure you are not setting a target that is unrealistic and that you can't actually deliver. So a decarbonization plan, also known as a carbon reduction plan or a decarbonization strategy or sustainability plan, many different names, is a document that will basically show your carbon emission, communicate your target, and detail how you will be meeting this target and the actions that you will be taking. Can be an internal document, can be an external document. There is no recommended template. It is recommended that you are transparent about the methodology that you use to quantify your emission, that you're transparent about what you will be delivering and not over-promising so you don't get accused of greenwashing. And the most important thing from my viewpoint is that it's not seen as a ticking block exercise. It's much better to have a small decarbonization plan with only a few actions, but actions that you can deliver and you can report on, rather than having a decarbonization plan that is 40 pages long, but has loads of actions that you know fundamentally you don't have the capacity or the budget to deliver. So start small for bigger impacts. Here you will find the iterative process that I've mentioned. So it all starts with first quantifying your carbon emissions, understanding your carbon footprint and identifying these big areas of impact, setting your overarching target, selecting your interventions to achieve that target. Check that the targets you've selected allow you to meet that target so you can have that little refining and fine tuning of which target you're going for and what you're going to deliver to reach that target. That allows you to confirm the targets and intervention and then move into the implementation of your action plan. You should then monitor and report on your progress, including reviewing your carbon emissions and how those are evolving through time, which then allows you to review your action plan, modify it, and continue to deliver it. In terms of interventions that you can deliver, we classify them in two different categories. You have what we call your system-led intervention. These are your hard intervention. They'll be targeting your carbon hotspots. They'll be targeting these categories that we talked about in the scope. This is investing in retrofitting your building or an energy efficiency measure, shifting your vehicle assets, your vehicle fleet to EVs. These are your system-led intervention. And then you have your enablers. Your enablers are your soft interventions. They're not necessarily going to lead to a huge amount of carbon savings, but what they do is they build that foundation. They build your capacity so that as an organization, you have the skills, the knowledge, the governance, the processes, and you're much more efficient in terms of delivering your system-led intervention, which can be more costly and more complex. We've seen these before, but your systems-led intervention can very much be seen as mean, lean, and green. So again, completely removing an asset or eliminating something from your business would be mean. Lean is everything around efficiency, and green is making, changing the input or the supplier to move towards something that is more low carbon. I've added here SEEN, which are your nice to do intervention, environmental volunteering day, partnering with an environmental charity, giving your employees a day off to go and do something for the environment. Again, not great in terms of reducing carbon, but can be great for morale boosting and getting people involved with decarbonization. Now, in your enablers can be categorized in many different ways, and this should, in the end, be bespoke to your organization. We like to categorize them in these 4 areas, and you'll see that there's some overlap between those enablers. Governance will be about setting the appropriate internal and external governance structure so that you have roles and responsibility and accountability when you're delivering your plan. Finance is all about allocating a budget, maybe having a shadow carbon price that allows you to inform your decision-making process, and adopting whole life costing, particularly if you're building things, so you can balance capital expenditure with operational savings. Skills and behaviors is my favorite. It's where you can have an amazing impact while contributing to your workforce growth and personal and professional development. But this is everything around upskilling, whether it's general sustainability knowledge or more technical training, and it's helping change the behavior of your staff. There's been great research done by the Carbon Literacy Project that by investing into your staff's upskilling around sustainability, each person can reduce their own carbon footprint by 5 to 15%. So you can see how that can have a huge impact on your organization. And then unsurprisingly, there is data. So continuing to monitor your carbon footprint, sharing that data, making it accessible, sharing lessons learned, and making sure that in your organization, it really becomes embedded as one of your key processes. Now, very quickly, you will need to prioritize your action. So make sure that you start with your easy to intervene, high impact area. Don't get stuck on interventions that are difficult and won't have a big carbon impact, which is again why it's so important that you understand your carbon emissions. When you do this exercise, you will again need to assess your appetite for risk, because depending on the appetite for risk, that ease will differ depending on the organization. And this is just an indication of how you can set realistic timeline and balance different kind of intervention. Your enablers are great things to front load. They bring your employees together. They bring momentum and consensus around your decarbonization plan. You'll also have some quick wins. Great to always have 1 or 2 in your first year. So again, you can show that you're progressing. Never forget that you must mobilize for your more complex intervention and start thinking about how you can finance some of these interventions. This is obviously a suggestion and an oversimplification, but something that should be considered when you build your plan. And finally, some final little best practice. Do set a budget for your plan. Too many times we've seen organizations that commit to decarbonization, but don't actually have any money to deliver it. Always review and revise it. Use simple language. Doesn't have to be a complicated document. Be fully transparent about your methodology, your carbon footprint, your level of ambition, what you can actually deliver. Integrate actions within your organization and appoint action owners. Set success metrics beyond just carbon. Is it going to have an impact on your productivity, on cost saving, on health and well-being of your workforce? All of that allows you to have a more complete picture of the benefits of decarbonization, and again, will help you gain hearts and minds in terms of delivering it. If you can, make sustainability and decarbonization part of people's jobs and include it in their job responsibility so they don't end up with an extra thing to do in addition to everything else. Share data, engage, and don't forget that you should really focus on those short-term action, provide more detail for the short-term actions. You'll be able to control them a little bit more, but don't lose sight of those long-term actions and mobilizing and preparing your organization to achieve those. And involve more than just your employees. Make sure to involve suppliers, bring them on board. It'll help decarbonize your scope 3 emissions. And again, investors, board members, these are all people that will be concerned about climate change and the impact that it has on the business. So do involve them in the process. And a final little note, today I've talked a lot about carbon, but don't get stuck in a carbon tunnel vision. Sustainability is about a lot more than carbon. It's why it's so complex. And too often we've seen that people get focused on carbon and will implement actions that can sometimes have negative externalities. So this is why I've mentioned set success metrics that go beyond just carbon. Look at pollution, the amount of waste that you're producing. Look at your climate risks, your impact on biodiversity, the health and well-being of your employees. Can you generate social values and interesting partnerships? All of that will help with decarbonization and really allow you to move towards a more sustainable operating model. And that is it. Thank you so much, and apologies, I overran by a few minutes.
Not at all, Letizia. I think that was great. Thank you very much. We do have a little bit of time for some quick questions. perhaps we could start with this one. What immediate first step should I take if I want to decarbonise?
Thank you, Paul. So the first step should be to measure your carbon footprint. And to do this, the first immediate step as an organization is, one, determine whether or not at any point your organization has already measured your carbon footprint. This may have happened particularly around 2008 and 2012 when there was a big push towards doing it. Try to understand what data you already have and whether or not there is already, tends to be an Excel spreadsheet, but whether or not there is an Excel spreadsheet that was used to measure and quantify those emissions. Then have a look at free tools. There are great tools out there that you can use to have access to emissions factor, help you quantify your carbon emissions. Do get help. I cannot not be here with my lovely little banner. We can help you also with quantifying your emissions. But your first thing should be, have we done it before? If yes, what systems did we put in place? What data do we have? Did we have an Excel spreadsheet? If no, what would the company be willing to do to measure? Is it something that someone in the company does on an Excel spreadsheet? Do we use one of the free tools online? Do we go with an external solution provider?
Okay. And what actions should I prioritise to decarbonise?
Great question. So obviously as a manufacturing business, you have, as I mentioned very early in the presentation, you can impact your own direct emission as well as your suppliers. So through your own operations, I would, in general, buildings tends to be where there's the most carbon emissions. So have a look at any energy efficiency measures, any quick win around switching to LEDs or procuring renewable energy or investing in solar panels. Do have a look also at your vehicles and machine if there's any efficiency there. Then have a look at your supply chains, engage your suppliers. And this can really be just a session with your top 10 biggest suppliers. What are they doing? What measures have they put in place? Can you help one another to both work together? And then very importantly, look at the design of the products that you are manufacturing. 80% of a product's carbon footprint and environmental footprint comes from its design. So think very early on what you can do in terms of its actual design, how it's going to be then disassembled and processed at the end of its life. Can you change the material inputs that you are using? Can you use less energy, less water? Can you be more efficient in terms of how you're producing it? And can a small design change mean that you use way less material in it?
Okay. I think that unfortunately that's all we have time for today. But as you asked during the presentation whether this would be the slides would be available, this presentation will be available via the manufacturing management website for anybody who wants to watch it. But in the meantime, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Letitia, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I will answer all the questions. I can see them in the chat now.